Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a panel discussion on transforming anti-sexual violence programming to better support survivors, engage students, and respond to harm. I invite all panelists to join me on screen by turning cameras. Perfect. My name is Kate, and I'll be moderating our panel today. I'm a proud activist and University of Alberta student joining from Treaty 6 territory. I work with organizations such as SFCC to help fight against gender-based violence and help bring educational platforms such as these. I'm excited to have these panelists join us today from all across Canada working on anti-sexual violence programming and services for post-secondary students. These include efforts to support survivors, engage bystanders, and work with those who've committed harm. Today we will discuss how safe spaces can be designed to support the unique needs of individuals with different identities, accountability, and the importance of continued collaboration for supports. I'm really looking forward to the rich discussion and diverse perspectives presented. As part of the forum, we want to invite participants to submit programs that you know of that are making a difference on campus in regards to sexual violence. You can find the form in the chat below, and after the event, we'll be sharing these through email and on the forum website. Participants can learn further about the panelists in the program, but for now I want to turn it over to them to briefly introduce themselves. I'm happy to shine the spotlight onto Johannah and then Casandra.
Thank you so much, Kate. My name is Johannah Black. I use she, her pronouns, and I am speaking to you today from the unceded and ancestral territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. It's really important when we address sexualized violence that we center settler colonialism as one of the root causes. And these land acknowledgements are one of the ways that we can begin to do that. I work at the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus.
Casandra, feel free to introduce yourself.
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Casandra. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am a consent and sexual violence educator, and I create community spaces for Black survivors because I do think it's important to focus on our own history with sexual violence and creating our sexual identities, gender identity, and those things. I am a university student at Ryerson and also harm reduction worker. And yes.
Fantastic, thank you. Now we'll have Marylise and then Naomi to have a chance to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marylise. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an educator at the AnnaLise Sexual Assault Support Center at the University of British Columbia. I'm also a fourth-year psychology student, and I'm happy to be here with everyone. So, yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi Martey, she, her pronouns for me. I'm a community organizer and I'm a service provider currently working at the Toronto Rape Crisis Center, Multicultural Women Against Rape. I primarily work with survivors of sexual violence that are youth or who are part of the Black community. And the work that I do is specifically individual counseling and support groups, and largely I've been focusing a lot on doing groups for young people. That's what's been our priority right now. And so outside of work, I focus on migrant detention work and labor rights. And I was raised on the Haldimand Tract, which is land granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral. I'm also a reluctant academic at OAC. I talk a lot. Yeah, that's it.
Great, and we'll finally have AnnaLise.
Hi, I'm AnnaLise. I go by she, her, and I'm situated in London or on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, the Haudenosaunee peoples, and the Lenni and Lenape peoples. And I am working at ANOVA, which is the Gender-Based Violence Shelter and Sexual Assault Center in London. And particularly for this panel, we do a few key projects with our local campuses that have been longstanding. So I think community partnerships that sort of cross the divide of the ivory tower to community are pretty essential. And I'll chat more about that.
Thank you. I'm absolutely honored to share the space with all these wonderful experienced individuals. Our first question for this afternoon actually deals with educational programs. So panelists, how can we develop prevention education that addresses the root causes of sexual violence and encourages systematic change? Let's first hear from Johannah.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you for your question. I think this is such an important question to start with and to think about. It's really important that we acknowledge that the work that we do and the knowledge that we generate is never the work of one individual. It's always the work of community. So when I'm speaking here and sharing what I've learned, it's really important to share that this knowledge is something that has been gifted to me from the communities which I'm a part of, from the communities that I've worked with, including the Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia, where I was located before moving here to BC, including the students that I've worked with over the years, including Students for Consent Culture, including my feminist elders at the Antigonish Women's Resource Center and Sexual Assault Center, where I worked previously as well. The knowledge that I share is a gift from all of these various communities. And so when I speak, we speak together. It's also really important, as I mentioned, that if we address the root causes of sexualized violence, and Sean's talk spoke on this so beautifully, that we center settler colonialism as one of the root causes. In sexual violence work, a lot of the work that's being done rarely touches on the root causes of sexualized violence. When we do touch on the root cause, we often acknowledge misogyny or sexism, patriarchy as some of those root causes, but rarely do we acknowledge settler colonialism as one of those root causes. And I think that this is essential to the work. We must center the ongoing struggles for Indigenous sovereignty, as well as the teachings, the protocols, the resurgence of Indigenous cultures and knowledge in the work that we do. This means that we work to both maintain, to strengthen, and to build with the Indigenous communities, with the nations who have been the protectors and the stewards of the land that we are situated on since time immemorial. When we build and center these relationships, we do not do so on our own terms as uninvited settlers. We do so on the terms of the Indigenous communities and their protocols. You know, it's really important that we recognize that things like ceremony, like the Thanksgiving address that Elder Norma Jacobs gave at the beginning, these are not just decorations to put at the beginning and the end of our work. These are central to the work that we do. Elder Norma's teachings are more important than anything I could possibly share with you today. It is those teachings that we should be taking to heart, reflecting on, and moving forward with. I don't want to take up too much time because I know my co-presenters have so much wisdom to share as well. But one thing I wanted us all to reflect on that Elder Norma shared, she mentioned that everyone comes with a gift. And similarly, speaking to one of my colleagues at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus, where I work now, in Indigenous programs and services, named Cardinal, and we were talking about what education, what pedagogy might look like from an Indigenous perspective. And he shared with me the importance of humility and moving forward in a way that is humble. And that really goes against so much of what academia is about, which is why I am also a reluctant academic. I love that phrase, because it's really important that we refuse the violent logics of academia in the work that we do? And what would it look like if we approached the work that we do with this teaching shared by Elder Norma Jean, that everyone comes with a gift? That's where I'll leave off for now. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your response. Marylise, I know you have some education you're an educator within different centers. So how do you think we can address this?
I really like what Johannah said about, like the education happens in community. We're sort of like all contributing to like this well of knowledge. So as much as I am considered an educator, I'm also a student, not just in the formal sense, but I'm constantly just learning from the people around. Even here, I'm picking up on so many bits of knowledge. So I think it's important to have, again, that humility that Johannah was mentioning. So in terms of like my work as an educator, so I do a lot of workshops mainly around how to respond to disclosures of sexual assault. And I think for me, it's a couple of things. I try to relate the material to my lived experience. So recognizing like my own identities within anti-violence work, addressing sexualized violence. And an important lesson, like I learned from my manager, Ashna, is on how, we talk a lot about like intersectionality, right? And sort of like this rehashed terminology that's like sort of losing meaning, but it's always good to contextualize sexualized violence within our identities, not just considering like disadvantages, but also, where our privileges are, and how those things can make us hypervisible or invisible within sexualized violence. But it's also important to recognize how these identities are not like vulnerabilities. Like, we're not these barriers that we face due to our identities. It's not because those identities are inherently right. These oppressions comes from systems, right? So we exist within these different systems of oppression, and they're not, and that these things, we have to sort of separate them from the individual. So like, for example, like, me being Black or being queer isn't like inherently oppressive, like it's not an inherent problem. It's more, identify what those systems in place are, like racism or homophobia, right? So naming what those systems of oppression are, I think, are important in like identifying how they play into addressing sexualized violence. And that way we're recognizing sexualized violence as less of an individual issue and more of something that exists within like institutions, and that is about power and control. So yeah, for me, it's more about like, how do we separate or how do we like providing the language around talking about sexualized violence to students, how, so that they understand that like they have, the words to express their experiences, and also talk about how we build cultures of consent by separating ourselves from these systems of oppression, and recognizing the individual as, like separate from them. And also just talking to people about the different barriers that people face when trying to address an experience of sexualized violence, such as like, within an institution like academia, there are certain power dynamics that can prevent students from disclosing. So for example, they might have experienced sexualized violence from like a TA, for example, and that's a unique situation of power. And just recognizing that these issues are larger than ourselves. So yeah, those are the main things that I try to focus on within my work.
Fantastic. Yeah, these are great connections to consider in our education programs and everything. So Naomi and Casandra, we know that healing doesn't look the same for everyone and that individuals from marginalized communities may face barriers to seeking support. So how do we ensure these safe spaces for those affected by sexual violence do not reproduce inequalities or harm?
You want to go first?
Well, with Naomi. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I wrote down Naomi, but we can go with.
That's all good. Yeah, when I was reading this question, the biggest thing I thought about was how, okay, so the name of my organization is long and intense. So it's called the Toronto Rape Crisis Center / Multicultural Men Against Rape. People are like, why? And I think it's really important. For me, I start with that because it's actually two names. Toronto Rape Crisis Center began about 50 years ago. It was created with feminist intentions to create hope for a world without gender-based violence. It was about a community riot for love, for justice, for care for one another. That is what the center represented. It was a powerful thing, word rape. And in the 90s, it became really increasingly clear that the name of the organization didn't represent the diversity of people coming through the doors, the diversity of needs in Toronto, that it didn't represent the amount of racialized individuals who had worked very hard to create a space where people could come and could be in a very authentic way. So the name changed, it grew in a certain way. And now we kind of look at our name and we understand that it doesn't meet violence where it's at because many more than just women are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence. So our name looks like a closed door to a lot of people who actually could really access our services. And so I say all of this because I think that organizations, we have to understand that violence continuously occurs despite our intentions because it's kind of baked into our ways of knowing. We really will understand ourselves as making this move towards the right thing, and revealed to us will be things that we didn't even conceptualize because they were outside of our realm of bias. And so I say this because it's deeply important to not be too fragile to address the violence that I think is inevitable in the work that we do, not be too fragile to do the work that is hopefully restorative, that takes account, that works with community, especially because as service providers in this field, you're working with people in a very vulnerable place. So what does it mean to in a genuine way, kind of understand that we must find solutions, or we must fundamentally change until we become a place that feels more like the solution again. That for me is kind of a framing that feels more important than kind of a list of things, because I don't think that we can predict what we're going to do wrong. We probably wouldn't do it if we knew it was going to hurt someone. So what does it mean to not rebuild these harms? I think it's about who we are, what we do, how we do it. And I want to add to that by saying that the center tries to work to do that, my center, and that we're a feminist collective, a feminist survivor collective that is largely racialized, and we are women and non-binary folks. So in very deliberate ways to do this work in the center of being like, I will provide you this service, survivorship is deeply important to our way, our method, and our practice. Organizing with each other on an equal level as survivors, as a collective and not as a hierarchy, is deeply important, because what does it mean for hierarchy to beget injustice, to beget non-consent? We try to really embody these pieces so that they will become a part of the services that we provide, and we can maybe face less of these harms that continue to manifest by having more care, having more humility, as others have said. And so, yeah, those are kind of my thoughts on that question. Thank you.
Casandra, would you like to add anything?
Yes, so in creating safe spaces, usually safe spaces are created because there's a lack of representation, a lack of care provided for certain groups of people, and they feel like we need a space where we can collectively heal as community, feel like we're not being silenced or being tokenized. So they're usually created as like a way to craft your own type of like community healing space. But like, I feel like it should go beyond safe spaces, and like it needs to be implemented in policy work, in like non-disclosure. It needs to be implemented in the language you use towards people, and even like what we consider sexual violence and consent work. The more I start to do this work and creating like safe spaces, I start to realize like there is like sometimes a lack of nuance in what we consider sexualized violence, especially for Black people. Like having bodily unsafety, like feeling like as a Black person, you're not safe in your body. It's also like sexual violence. Feeling like you are moving in the world as a with the constant physical threat is a part of that work. So creating like a safe space, it's a start, but I also think it needs to be implemented in like the policies that we do, non-disclosure, even how people report, like thinking about, do we have like different ways of healing and transformative justice? Like, are we actually like practicing that and learning from elders in communities who have been doing this work without getting paid for it, as like community elders, stuff like that. And also not gatekeeping spaces, because universities, we're amazing, we have the best programming, but what about people who don't have access to universities? Sometimes they're not allowed to access our programming. And it's something that we need to question, because people who are in these safe spaces, they're part of larger communities. We need to spread that within the community, within people who don't have access to things, who don't have access to safe spaces, right? We need to extend that care and that type of knowledge to them. We need to also prioritize the way that they provide live experience, the way that they provide support to communities. We need to see that as like good work, instead of like just kind of taking their ideas and moving it throughout institutions, which I kind of have noticed while doing this work. So for me, like as I'm creating like safe spaces for community, I always think of like, how am I extending this beyond my university? Because I'm not just a university student, I'm a Black person from Scarborough, I'm a Black person with low income experience. And I do know that a lot of people who have my experience aren't extended that same care because they can't access institutions. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that right now.
Thank you. Yeah, this is definitely can be considered in a way broader topic, but thank you for pointing that out. AnnaLise, you've been in many positions where providing support to survivors is crucial. What aspects of accountability do you think are important to remember when it comes to providing support to survivors on campus?
Yeah, so it's in particular, the campus that I'm working with, Western, and what played out last fall, and sort of the centering of accountability in that. So, responsive supports for survivors without significant wide-scale ongoing prevention and engaging those who have caused harm misses the mark of accountability. And while it's absolutely needed, and folks are speaking to it much more eloquently than I, there's also needed investment around that prevention and engaging directly with folks who caused harm. And a lot of sort of campuses over the past, what has it been, 7-8 years, since in particular in Ontario, there was a requirement of a policy on campus by the Wynne government. There's been lots of sort of infrastructure built up. But what we haven't actually seen is, the investment dollars where we're thinking about small group conversations for every student on campus. So that's what's going out right now at Western, being driven by both ANOVA and the Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children. And we're having 90-minute small group conversations with up to 30 students for all 5,000 in first-year residences. And that is an immense investment, frankly, of money and sort of labor and time But that's where I think we need to go when we're actually doing justice for survivors, when we're actually trying to sort of not just be reactive, but preventative. Large scale forums where we talk about what consent is for 20 minutes doesn't actually change behavior. And it's important, and it's sort of part of shifting language, and those are true things. And we need to get into the disruptive, value shifting, holding folks accountable in those small group spaces. So I think that's pretty key. The other one that's sort of really uncomfortable to sit with, but you know, campuses are not very good at this, is that we're really good at naming that it's like 1 in 4 and 1 in 10 will be survivors in Canada. We're less good at naming who's going to perpetrate. And the reality from the research, what we know is that it's about 30% of undergraduate men will commit a form of sexual assault. And until we can name that and grapple with that and then target that very specifically, we're not going to do justice and accountability for survivors. And so we've been running since 2015 a program called Man-Made on campus. And that's been a partnership where Western brings in Innova staff to provide 5 sessions for men who've caused harm, who've committed sexual violence against student code of conduct. And we combine them with men who opt into the program. And so there's, you know, lots of ways that that program is imperfect, and it's sort of rubbing against ways that are not, there's value misalignment, and we're trying to step into the work of holding accountability for those. And there's been other campuses that have taken on that program or different ways of doing that. But I will say what sort of the challenge for me with that program is that these are held once a semester for about, you know, 10 or 15 guys. That is not the scale we need. That is not matching that 30%. So really accountability is to require significant investments in the prevention and engaging those who do harm.
Thank you. I'd also like to hear from you too, Marylise.
Yeah, so I feel similarly to AnnaLise, where like within anti-violence work, it can sort of feel like we're addressing violence like after it happens, instead of like putting in place preventative measures so that they don't happen. And you know, like within my role, it does, like, unfortunately, it does feel like I'm doing that after effect work where I'm trying to help people talk about sexualized violence once it happens. And so I can only sort of speak to dealing with accountability after sexualized violence has been committed. So for me, that's really about language. So, you know, trying to shift towards person-first language where we're honoring the experiences of people who have been impacted by sexualized violence and mirroring the language that they're using when talking about their experience, and not assuming how they want to talk about their experience. So we tend to use language like survivor and victim or perpetrator or rapist without, you know, understanding and like actively listening to how the individual speaking about their experience. So sort of moving towards like using language like a person who chose to use sexualized violence against someone, because by shifting towards that, you're actually adding accountability, right? You're emphasizing that this was a choice that was made by an individual, and they're not just like, you know, using the word like perpetrator. You know, someone can choose not to identify as a perpetrator, but when you sort of emphasize that they're making a choice to harm someone, then it becomes, you're able to hold them accountable to that. And then also when it comes to using words like survivor and victim, those words have certain expectations of what it means to have experienced sexualized violence. So being aware of sort of what those connotations are, and ensuring that the person who's speaking about their experience is comfortable with the language that you're using. So yeah, to me, it's about person-first language, and also that work of actively listening. Like, are you simply telling someone how they should be addressing their experience? Like, of course, you need to go to a sexual assault support center, like that's not necessarily someone's first response. Maybe they just actually want to go on a walk, for example. So just like that kind of accountability is more personal, I guess. Like how are you showing up for people who have been impacted by sexualized violence? And yeah, but on the other side of that, when I think about prevention, I think, or maybe this is still just an after effect, I just think in general, there needs to be more investment in sexual assault support centers. Like, for example, our sexual assault support center is very underfunded. And, you know, I think for us to do our work, it's important to be compensated for it, right? It's a lot of it is, or for me, it's like a lot of like emotional labor. And yeah, I think there's certain kinds of labor that goes into the work that's not really being accounted for. So yeah, for me, it's investment. And then when it comes to just the education work, it's around language and actively listening.
Thank you so much. I realize that accountability can be a wide range from peers to larger centers. So thank you for speaking on that. And speaking of all this work we do in the movement, community-based anti-violence organizations play a significant role in advocacy and services. How do we continue to leverage their expertise to better support gender-based violence in a sustainable way? Johanna, do you have any thoughts on this?
I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. As I mentioned, I used to work for a community organization in Nova Scotia on the unceded ancestral territories of the Mi'kmaq people. I worked at the Indigenous Women's Resource Center and Sexual Assault Services Association. And I'm so proud of the work that I did there. I see that some of my former colleagues are here as attendees. But I think, you know, the work that we did together is some of the best work being done in the province. Working with universities and colleges, my specific role was to deliver bystander intervention training to all of the universities and community colleges in Nova Scotia as one person. Many campuses did not have sexual violence prevention and response offices until a year or two ago. And it's really important that universities acknowledge, or post-secondary institutions in general, acknowledge that community organizations are picking up a lot of the work that isn't being done on campus, not just the education work, but in terms of supporting survivors and providing access to trauma therapy. There's a lot of work that's being done, and most of the time that work is not being funded by the post-secondary institutions. It's being funded through government grants that are 1 to 2 years long and that oftentimes do not pay a living wage. So I recently moved to British Columbia, now on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation, where I work for the University of British Columbia Okanagan campus and the Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Office. And honestly, it was a big decision for me to move back into academia, because academia, in my own personal experiences as a survivor, has been a major source of sexualized and gender-based violence. On top of that, our academic institutions are violent settler colonial institutions as well. And so it was a very tough decision to take a job again in an academic institution. At the end of the day, a lot of that decision was made based on not making a living wage at my previous position and constantly being in 1 year to 2 year contracts, which is just too stressful to handle, especially in a job that's already so stressful, involving so much vicarious trauma, being overworked and underpaid and being so dedicated to the work. And I know that's not just the institution, the organization I was at, it's across the board for all community-based organizations. They are not funded adequately by the government. And on top of that, the universities that use, or the post-secondary institutions that use so much of our labor are not providing any source of funding or support a lot of the time. I know there are some examples of universities that do have funding agreements with community organizations, but that is not the norm. And I do think that's something we should be looking at. You know, it's hard because these types of organizations are really at the forefront of pushing for consent culture and creating consent culture and creating spaces where survivors can come together and push for that change. But, you know, the other thing is that a lot of times our expertise isn't recognized in academia. If we aren't academics, regardless of what degrees we have, if we're working in academia, our knowledge isn't seen as worthwhile as the people holding research chairs and things like that, right? So it's also about recognizing the work and the expertise. This is something so near and dear to my heart. I could talk for so long about it, but I will turn it over to whoever's next.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I feel like it's like a hidden truth that's not like known to the public and only for these individuals that are doing the work. So yeah, Naomi, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I was listening and I was like, dang. Like, how dare you tell everyone about my truth? Because yeah, like working in a community organization, you really you put a lot of your heart and your soul and your intentionality into the space, and the give back isn't financial. The give back isn't security. The give back is kind of what you are contributing and what you are doing in service of dignity and care to others. And unfortunately, that is a resource that institutions think is infinite. But what I wanted to say was that these questions have me in story time, but I worked at the Women's Resource Center at the University of Ottawa for a number of years when I was a student at UOttawa. And one thing that I think is really unique about that campus is that we had the only wet frosh in Ontario, because they would just take people across the border into Gatineau and you could drink and you can come back. And so it was this very intense event where after we would get this huge wave of students that would come to us who had experienced sexual violence. It was a huge wave. It was every year. We put so many different strategies in place to talk to like frosh leaders and like the bars in Gatineau. Like we had tried to do all of this protective work, but ultimately we had all of this intensity coming through our doors. And then in juxtaposition with that, we were a student service, and therefore there was a lot of turnover. And so some of us were even not very experienced in the positions on campus, but all these students were coming to us because we were in their brochure, right? Like we were where to go, which is important work, because I think we were a good first step, but it was intensely overwhelming in a lot of ways. And so I think that what is important is being able to understand what is the work within my capacity when you work on campus, because I think that there are a multitude of different service options. Like there are student union services, there are administration run services. The big difference I find is administration gets a lot more payment and they have a lot less turnover. And so like figuring out what is the mosaic on my campus, what am I capable of doing, and what do I need support in doing from the greater community? Because there is, when there's university, there's a bit of a city around you. Not always, but sometimes. And there are other services that exist. It's a mosaic, I would really say. And so I think that it's deeply important to stand these are the resources that exist on this campus. I am clear about them. And this is what I can refer into community. And I think a part of that is hiring people on campuses that know the city, that know the services a little bit. I find that there's so much turnover and it's so fast, and it's people trying to learn so much and they're doing these services when we have a lot of people in the community that are local that understand the map a little bit. And so that would be something that I would recommend. Like, people are already connected to these services. We don't necessarily have to hire someone who has to learn about them from scratch and then try to refer them. And then finally, I feel like I just wanted to jump a bit off of Cassandra's point about campus services are not necessarily accessible to folks that aren't on campus. And I wanted to say that community agencies, well, actually what I want to say is that a lot of the times campus services may be fundamentally not able to you as a student who is a survivor because of maybe fear, worry that your privacy is not going to be respected, or the fact that you don't have it in you to be dealing with your experience, keeping your marks up, paying for your school room. And so you're not really going to be a student anymore because this is a place that has conditions on you being there and you're overwhelmed. And now your service and your support is connected to this institution with conditions. And now your support is connected to conditions. And I think that's a very dangerous and harsh connection to make as a survivor, for the service provision to be in some ways connected to how much you can keep your grades up. That's a really intense and raw deal. And so I think a little bit about what does it mean to acknowledge that and see that as a campus service provider, you are part of an institution that may be very hard for someone to interface with. And so therefore understanding, what can I give into community? What can I do here on campus? Just a little shout out to TRCC. I think it's important for places that are in the GTA to know that as a center, we very much try to reject kind of clinical institutional settings. And we try to validate that living in a settler colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, and ableist world creates and enhances trauma. That's a part of the work that we do. And it's easier for us to do it outside of institutions with conditions. So we're not a hospital, we're not a clinic, we're not a university, we're hopefully a collective of people that are here to support one another. And understanding that and offering that to students as an alternative with intention, I think is really meaningful in a way to support the work that we do. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and this ties into our next question perfectly. So those involved in the anti-violence work are familiar with the importance of collective care due to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. What have you guys found the most impactful in promoting and enabling the well-being of advocates? We'll start off with Casandra.
I just also want to add to what Naomi said about feeling like you need that added support on campus and your care is not conditional. As someone who started university, had my own history of sexual trauma, without the support of my sexual violence office, I wouldn't have been able to get through school and get support to continue my studies, right? Professors and other people, they don't really understand what long-term trauma could look like for sexual assault. Like if it's not sudden, it's not going to affect you and things like that. So having that understanding from your sexual violence office, mine is Consent Comes First at Rising University, really adds in your feeling like your support is continuous. Like if you are failing classes, you're not going to not get sexual violence care support. Another thing, in terms of collective community care, a lot of the times, I know like for Black students, we don't really we will meet together and just start talking about things that we're going through, right? And that's what started for me, for my group. Like, I noticed a lot of Black students who were experiencing sexual violence, whether it was childhood sexual violence, whether it was like hypersexualization, or just immediate sexual violence that was occurring to them right away. They wouldn't really feel like, because a lot of like feminist spaces, like women centers or like spaces, apply to them because of the way they will talk about sexual assault. They wouldn't feel like, oh, it's not going to lead to me going to the police, so I don't really think I should bring it up, kind of situation. So we'll just be talked about as you're amongst each other. And I realized like this will be happening like every week. And because I guess I'm like, people see me as a support person on campus, I was like always someone that was like, people were disclosing things to. I realized that we needed to create more of like a space for us to talk about the traumas of even generational sexual violence and things like that, or like the history of, like Johannah was saying, the history of like settler colonialism, white supremacy when it comes to Black bodies. Like, we need to sit down and talk about these, how it affects how we see ourselves and how we move through the world. But there was like also a issue with like me seeing people do tokenized like workshops to be like, oh, let's do a one-off in Black History Month, a one-off about Black feminism and hypersexualization. Like, there was no like real support, especially paid support, where we could get funding to have people educate us more on it, to have like elders, to have like to pay myself and other coordinators to run this space. There was no support like that until I started working with Consent Comes First. But prior to that, I just saw like a lot of community collective healing circle for Black History Month, or things like that. So I think when it comes to like collective community care, there needs to be an understanding to be continuous, and it needs to be beyond just like meeting in a space. There needs to be like policy set that provides certain supports for Black students who are experiencing sexual violence, like whether that could be like alternative healing methods, whether that could be like a transformative justice way of things, of seeking justice in that way, whether it be even seeking counseling from a Black counselor, or last time we had someone do trauma-informed Reiki, things like that. Like, there needs to be things put in place on how they're going to support Black survivors that go beyond our scope of what that looks like. Oh, it looks like reporting to police and then the university investigates. There needs to be an understanding that different groups of people are in sexual violence differently. Another thing about community healing, I think there needs to be Black folks and folks of different identities need to be at the backbone of creating their own type of supports and healing. You can't create it and then say, I'm going to put a Black face on it. It doesn't support Black community. That Black community knows what Black community needs for healing. So they need to be hired to create the programming. It needs to look more than someone sitting on a committee of sexual violence. I used to be on a lot of committees and it will annoy me because I know that it didn't really, like, my voice didn't really matter on those committees. It wouldn't really do much. It was just like, we need at least one Black person on this committee. So it needs to look more like actually creating a framework for Black programming on campus for survivors, right? Hiring someone in a full-time position, like that. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. The continued support, the compensation for our work, all very essential. I want to spend the last few minutes of this thinking about what is the most important thing we could do to make a difference in supporting programming to address sexual violence. Let's start with Naomi and then we'll go to Johannah.
I think that, well, programming is such a vast word, but it comes in so many different formats. But I think that creating avenues so that survivors of violence can be authentic participants in a community that supports one another is absolutely key. Because yes, at the beginning, people want an hour of time with a service provider, but ultimately I think we're looking for community, we're looking for understanding, we're looking for holding. We're looking for the radical active listening. So creating spaces that see it as deeply important to connect and to hold and to not see yourself as a provider as so far away from the process, I think is key, because it sustains itself. It means that people can work with and for one another, even when you are indisposed. And that good work is work that makes people less and less dependent on you. Because yeah, I'm not always gonna be here. But maybe those connections you made in your community without conditions, because I come with conditions as a worker, are what are going to provide long-term healing. Yeah.
Thank you. Johannah?
Hey, do you mind repeating the question? I was still processing so many of the brilliant things Casandra was saying that I didn't get it.
Of course, yeah, I'm like trying to write down notes as well. This is the most important thing like to do to make a difference in supporting programming to address sexual violence?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most important things is going back to that like centering of settler colonialism as the root cause, and working to build and maintain and strengthen those relationships with Indigenous community. And I think, you know, one of the most important things about this is recognizing, I think Marylise said it too, that we're not just teachers, we're here to learn, and then that's lifelong learning. And that's approaching the work with humility. And so recognizing that, you know, so many of the tools that we think as anti-violence workers that we have to address violence haven't really been working. Some of them have, some of them haven't. But working with Indigenous communities, for example, to, you know, we have our understanding in the English language from a Western perspective, what consent is, but what does consent mean in Indigenous cultures? What are the words in the Indigenous language, like in Tsilhqot'in, where I'm located on Syilx Okanagan territory? What are the words for consent? And what does that mean under Syilx culture, but also Syilx law, right? We need to, we center so much of our work around like Canadian law, which is such a settler colonial and violent institution, but there are Indigenous laws and protocols. And what does consent mean under those laws and protocols? And what would it mean to start there rather than starting with what does consent mean under settler colonial law? And also, you know, working to center the things, the knowledge and the stories of Indigenous elders, like so many of the teachings Elder Norma Jean shared with us today. It just even around like the teachings that she shared around reciprocity and gratitude towards, you know, not just individuals, but also like all of the animals, the land, the wind. To really center those teachings, what would our understanding of consent look like? So yeah, that's what I would like.
Thank you so much for that perspective. What are your thoughts, Marylise? And then we'll go to AnnaLise.
I really like what Naomi was saying around like not forming like a dependent relationship between like between the people who are seeking support from these centers, and sort of empowering them enough that they can continue that care, like similar to what Casandra was saying, like supporting centers enough that we're able to have continuity of care, that this healing is happening in community, and whether or not like certain people are around because they'll, like, you know, people leave jobs and things change, right? So like having centers that are well funded and supported to create the sort of programming that lasts even when people leave. So yeah, so I really like that theme around continuity of care, and then also just paying people for their labor. Like, again, so much labor that is going unpaid, and it's, especially for racialized folks, it's like, not to say that holding minority identities doesn't like exempt you from rape culture or sexualized violence, but I think when you hold certain identities, it becomes like there's no like break, if that makes sense. It's sort of like you're continuously living within this like culture of violence, and so it's like extra important to have that care, financially, like emotionally. It's important to just have enough support around that. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. Emily?
For me, it would be programming, and I feel a bit like a broken record, but programming targeting men, and targeting not in a finger pointy shaming way, because that doesn't lead to behavior change. And also really, really recognizing that that work is not the work that everyone needs to take on or should, and nor should it detract from work that is directly supporting survivors or other spaces. And unless we can, again, grapple with 30% and really sit in the discomfort that the folks doing this are the people we know and love and are in relationships, and target that behavior, we're never going to sort of finish this cycle and stop sexual violence. So for me, creating programming and investing in scaling that isn't shaming, that really actually starts from empathy. Talking about what rejection is like, because our sexual scripts mean that men will experience rejection at higher rates than other folks, and sort of healthy reactions to that. What are the sexual scripts that compel really harmful masculinities, and sort of entering that vulnerably with them, but then eventually shifting away, sort of focus from intent to the impact of their actions. And that sort of nuance is a really, really specific skill set and a really important part of this work that I don't think has been given enough attention.
Fantastic. Casandra, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes. So once again, I think that providing programming that also goes beyond what we view as traditional sexual violence and consent work. So providing education to people who might not identify with heterosexuality, providing like queer consent and sex education work is important as well. We need that work too. Providing nuanced programming for racialized identities. And I'm very much for creating your own niche programming. So like if someone's like, I need a South Asian collective community care group that's specifically for South Asian queer people, then yes, like if you feel like it needs to be that specific, that's okay too. I don't want to allowing people to take up space how they and what they feel like the community needs, because the people who know the best are the people from that community, right? So making sure that we not acknowledge that, and try to stay away from tokenization. Like everyone could be guilty, like anyone could be guilty of certain groups of people when creating programming. So just making sure that we pay attention to the people of those communities, and make sure that they have continuous support and continuous collective community care is really important. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah. Thank you for actually all the panelists for this discussion today. I love being in this environment of like-minded individuals discussing these important topics. So that concludes our panel, and now I'll turn it over to Linda, who will close the forum.
Thank you, Kate. And I certainly agree, just an absolutely absorbing conversation and lots to take away. I want to thank all the presenters and panelists for sharing your time and insights. And I would like now to call on Ashton Rodenshire to turn on your camera so that we can take a little sneak peek at some of the drawings you've been doing while the panel was discussing. Ashton, are you there?
Yes, sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to make sure that you were still in our virtual space.
I am here. I am sharing my my drawing screen through my camera. If you want me to share through the share screen, I just need to have permission enabled. But yeah, great, interesting panel. And if anybody has any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I will take an eye on the chat. And yeah, these graphics will be, I'm going to be finishing up the ones from earlier today, and the organizers can share them out with you all very, very soon. So thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashton. And we look forward to sharing them with all participants of the forum and to also have them on the Learning Network website. I'd like to make again a special thank you to Elder Norma Jacobs. I'd also like to thank the wonderful interpreters from the Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service and for standing by. And I see that they're still with us, and we truly appreciate that. Also to our colleague who provided support to participants wishing to debrief. And again, just a reminder that everyone can find a link to a range of support resources in the forum program. As we wind down, just want to, on behalf of the Learning Network and Students for Consent Culture Canada, to thank everybody for not just attending, but engaging in such a vibrant way during this forum. You can learn more about both organizations in the forum program and in the websites posted in the chat. In response to the many questions we received during the forum, recordings of the presentations, panel discussions, and Q&A sessions, graphic drawings and audio descriptions, and PDF slide decks from both days of the forum will be made available once there's been a sign off in terms of presenters having a chance to view those. So hopefully those will be available in a few weeks. And all attendees will receive an email letting you know when they are available. And a final note, the link to the evaluation and certificate of attendance will appear in your browser when you leave Zoom. So on behalf of the group that brought you this, both groups, we say goodbye and please take care. And just from following the chat, it looks like there's going to be things that happen and connections outside of this virtual space that sound exciting, and I hope that that all goes well. So for now, goodbye and take care.